There's a moment, quiet, often invisible to others, when the empath begins to realize that what they once called love has, in many ways, been a form of self-abandonment. Not consciously, not intentionally, but gradually, through a lifetime of subtle conditioning. They learned early that connection required attunement, that safety depended on reading the emotional weather of others, and that their value was tied to how well they could soothe, support, and sacrifice. And so they became exquisitely sensitive. They could walk into a room and feel everything: tension, sadness, unspoken resentment. They developed an almost intuitive responsibility for emotions that were never theirs to carry. This is where Naïve empathy is born, not as a weakness, but as an adaptation, a brilliant, necessary adaptation for survival in environments where emotional unpredictability demanded vigilance. But the cost of this adaptation is rarely understood at first, because when empathy is not grounded in boundaries, it becomes porous. The empath doesn't just understand pain, they absorb it. They don't just care, they overextend. And over time, something subtle begins to erode within them. Resentment starts to coexist with compassion. Exhaustion hides beneath generosity. And there's a quiet, growing confusion. Why does giving so much feel so empty? This is the beginning of the fracture. It's not dramatic. It doesn't arrive with a clear declaration. It shows up in small moments. When the empath notices they are the only one reaching out, the only one apologizing, the only one trying to hold things together. It shows up when their kindness is met not with gratitude, but expectation. When their emotional labor becomes invisible, assumed, even exploited. And this is where something profound begins to shift. The empath starts to see that empathy, in its unexamined form, can become entangled with a need for approval, a fear of rejection, or an unconscious hope that by giving enough, they will finally feel secure. They begin to recognize that what felt like selflessness may have also been shaped by a deep discomfort with their own unmet needs. This realization can be unsettling because it challenges the identity they've built, the good one, the understanding one, the one who can handle anything. But in that discomfort, there is clarity, a kind of clarity that doesn't accuse, but reveals. They begin to understand that feeling deeply does not require them to tolerate harm. That compassion does not mean compliance. That love, if it is to be real, must include the self. And so the Naïve empathy begins to collapse, not in a way that hardens the person, but in a way that refines them. The empath doesn't lose their sensitivity, they lose their unconsciousness. They begin to ask different questions. Not, how can I fix this? But, why do I feel responsible for this? Not, how do I keep the peace? But, at what cost to myself? This is the threshold of the Sophia Stage. The moment where empathy is no longer driven by compulsion, but begins to move toward awareness. And it's important to understand, this is not a rejection of empathy. It is the maturation of it. Because true empathy does not erase the self, it includes it. It does not demand sacrifice, it requires truth. And sometimes, truth disrupts the very dynamics the empath once worked so hard to maintain. So what appears from the outside as a withdrawal, or even a change in personality, is in fact a reorientation. The empath is no longer relating from wounds. They are beginning to relate from consciousness. And that changes everything. Because the most powerful shift an empath can make is not in how deeply they feel for others, but in how honestly they are willing to feel for themselves. And once that honesty begins, the version of you that was built on self-abandonment can no longer survive. What begins to emerge after that initial fracture is something far less visible, but far more powerful. The empath, having seen the cost of their own unconscious giving, starts to develop a different relationship with their inner world. It's no longer just about feeling, it becomes about understanding. And from that understanding, something essential is born: discernment. Now, discernment is often misunderstood. People confuse it with judgment, with coldness, even with withdrawal. But discernment is none of those things. It is clarity without hostility. It is the ability to perceive what is actually happening within yourself and in others, without the distortion of old fears or unmet needs. For most empaths, this is unfamiliar territory, because earlier in life, their sensitivity was outwardly directed. They were highly attuned to others, but often disconnected from themselves. Their emotional radar worked brilliantly, but it was calibrated for survival, not truth. It was shaped by questions like, what does this person need from me? Or, how do I keep this relationship intact? But now, those questions begin to change. They become quieter, more precise, more honest. What is this interaction actually costing me? Is this care or is this control? Am I responding from presence or from fear? These are not easy questions. They require the empath to turn inward in a way they may have avoided for years. And what they often find there is not just insight, but grief. Grief for the times they overgave, for the boundaries they didn't know how to set, for the ways they tried to earn love rather than receive it. But this grief is not a regression. It's part of the awakening, because discernment cannot develop without truth, and truth often asks us to feel what we previously bypassed. As this inner clarity deepens, something subtle but profound begins to shift in how the empath engages with others. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. They begin to notice when someone's vulnerability is genuine and when it's performative. They can sense when they are being invited into connection and when they are being pulled into emotional responsibility that isn't theirs. And perhaps most importantly, they start to trust what they feel. This is a radical change, because for much of their life, the empath may have doubted their perceptions. They may have overridden their instincts to maintain harmony, dismissed their discomfort to avoid conflict, or second, guessed their boundaries to preserve attachment. But now, there is a growing alignment between what they sense and what they allow. They don't rush to fix. They don't rush to explain. They don't rush to absorb. They observe, and in that observation there is power. Not power over others, but power within the self. A grounded, steady awareness that says, I can see this clearly, and I don't need to betray myself to stay connected. This is where the empath begins to be perceived differently. Not because they've become harsh, but because they've become unavailable for dynamics that once relied on their unconscious participation. The patterns that used to draw them in no longer have the same access. And for people who were accustomed to the empath's openness, this can feel confusing, even threatening, because discernment disrupts familiarity. It interrupts cycles of overgiving and overseeving. It exposes where boundaries are needed, even if those boundaries are uncomfortable. And it removes the subtle agreements that once kept relationships imbalanced. But for the empath, this is not about distancing. It's about integrity. They are no longer trying to be everything to everyone. They are learning to be truthful in each moment. And that truth doesn't isolate them. It refines their connections. It filters out what is misaligned and creates space for what is real. So when we say the empath becomes dangerous, at this stage, what we're really pointing to is this: they can no longer be easily moved away from themselves. They cannot be persuaded to ignore what they see. They cannot be drawn into emotional entanglements that require their self-betrayal. And that changes the entire dynamic of how they exist in the world. Because once an empath learns to trust their own perception, they stop negotiating with what they know to be true. And that is where real power begins. Not in how deeply you feel others, but in how clearly you can see and still choose not to lose yourself. And then something even more misunderstood begins to take shape. Something that, from the outside, can look like distance, detachment, even indifference. But internally, it is none of those things. It is the emergence of silence, not as avoidance, but as power. For much of their life, the empath has relied on expression as a way to maintain connection. They explained themselves, often in great detail. They clarified their intentions, softened their words, adjusted their tone. They tried to ensure that nothing about them would be misinterpreted, because misinterpretation felt like disconnection, and disconnection felt unsafe. So they spoke, they over-explained, they filled in the emotional gaps. But now, something has changed. Because once discernment takes root, the empath begins to see that not every situation requires their voice. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Not every dynamic deserves their energy. And perhaps most importantly, not every person is willing or capable of meeting them in the depth they are offering. And so, they begin to choose silence. Not the silence of suppression, where truth is buried to keep the peace, but the silence of self-respect, where energy is no longer given automatically. This is a deliberate shift, a conscious withdrawal from the compulsion to be understood at all costs. Because they start to recognize something essential. When you are constantly explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you are not communicating, you are negotiating your own reality. And that negotiation comes at a price. So the empath pauses, they observe, they allow space where there used to be urgency. And in that space, something remarkable happens. They begin to feel their own presence more clearly. Without the noise of constant explanation, without the effort of managing perception, they come into a quieter, more grounded relationship with themselves. This silence is not empty. It is full of awareness, full of restraint, full of choice, and it has an impact. Because when an empath stops over-communicating, it disrupts the expectations around them. People who were used to access, used to emotional availability on demand, begin to feel that absence. They may interpret it as withdrawal, or distance, or even rejection. But what they are actually encountering is a boundary that is no longer being verbally negotiated. And that can be unsettling, because silence removes the usual entry points. There are no long explanations to dissect, no emotional cues to manipulate, no reassurances to lean on. There is just presence, calm, steady, and unavailable for distortion. This is why silence at this stage can feel dangerous to others. Not because it threatens harm, but because it reflects clarity. It forces people to confront what is actually there, without the empath softening or translating the experience for them. It reveals dynamics as they are, rather than as they have been explained into comfort. But for the empath, this silence is not about control over others. It is about alignment within the self. They are no longer speaking to convince. They are no longer explaining to be accepted. They are no longer filling space to avoid discomfort. They are choosing when and if to engage. And that choice changes everything, because when words are no longer driven by fear, they become intentional. When silence is no longer a defense, it becomes a form of strength. And when the empath stops trying to manage how they are perceived, they step into a kind of freedom that cannot be easily shaken. This doesn't mean they never speak. It means that when they do, it comes from a place of clarity, not compulsion. Their words carry weight because they are no longer diluted by overuse. Their presence communicates more than their explanations ever did. And perhaps the most important shift is this: they become comfortable being misunderstood. Not because they don't care, but because they understand that clarity does not guarantee acceptance, and they are no longer willing to abandon themselves just to be seen in a certain way. So silence in this stage is not an absence. It is a boundary. It is a statement that doesn't need to be spoken. I will not move away from myself to make this easier for you. And once an empath reaches that point, their presence alone begins to speak louder than any explanation ever could. Because true power is not found in how much you say. It is revealed in what you no longer feel the need to explain. As silence becomes more intentional, something else begins to reorganize itself within the empath, something that was always present, but previously overwhelmed by external noise. Their relationship to emotion itself begins to change. Not the fact that they feel deeply, that remains, but how they hold what they feel becomes entirely different. Earlier, emotions moved through them almost uncontrollably. They would pick up on others' pain and carry it as if it were their own. A shift in someone's tone, a subtle withdrawal, an unspoken tension. It was enough to trigger a cascade of internal responses. And because they hadn't yet learned to differentiate between what belonged to them and what didn't, those emotional experiences often led to reaction rather than reflection. But now, with discernment in place and silence creating space, the empath begins to do something profoundly transformative. They stop exporting their emotional experience outward and start processing it inward. This is where emotional alchemy begins, and alchemy in this sense is not about suppressing emotion or controlling it. It is about metabolizing it, allowing it to move through awareness without immediately acting on it. The empath begins to sit with what they feel, not as something to fix or discharge, but as something to understand. So when discomfort arises, they pause. They notice the sensation in the body, the thoughts that accompany it, the impulse to react. But instead of following that impulse automatically, they create a moment of space. And in that space, something new becomes possible. They begin to ask, quietly and honestly, what is this really about? Sometimes, what surfaces is not about the present moment at all. It's an old wound, an echo of past experiences where they felt unseen, unsafe, or unworthy. And in recognizing that, the emotion begins to shift. It is no longer just a reaction to someone else's behavior. It becomes a doorway into their own internal landscape. This is a radical shift in responsibility. Because instead of placing the burden of their emotional state on others, whether through blame or expectation, they begin to take ownership of their inner experience. Not in a self-critical way, but in a way that restores agency. They realize that while they cannot control what others do, they can transform how they relate to what arises within them. And this transformation is not immediate. It requires patience, honesty, and a willingness to stay present with discomfort without escaping it. But over time, something stabilizes. The empath becomes less reactive. Not because they feel less, but because they are no longer overwhelmed by what they feel. Their emotions are no longer leaking outward in search of resolution. Instead, they are being held, examined, and integrated. This creates a kind of internal containment that is deeply grounding. Others can feel it, even if they can't quite name it. There is a steadiness, a calmness, a sense that this person is not easily pulled into emotional chaos. And this changes the dynamic of every interaction. Because where there was once immediate engagement, there is now thoughtful presence. Where there was once urgency, there is now pacing. The empath is no longer reacting to be relieved, they are responding from awareness. And that distinction matters. Because reaction is often driven by unconscious patterns, by the need to resolve discomfort as quickly as possible. But response emerges from clarity. It allows for choice. It creates the possibility of acting in alignment, rather than out of habit. This is what makes emotional alchemy so powerful. It transforms pain into insight. It turns triggers into information. It allows the empath to remain open without becoming vulnerable to overwhelm. And perhaps most importantly, it reconnects them to themselves in a way that is stable, rather than dependent. They are no longer seeking emotional equilibrium through others. They are cultivating it within. And that internal stability is what makes their presence feel different, stronger, quieter, more grounded. Not because they are closed off, but because they are no longer scattered. They have learned to stay with themselves. And once an empath develops that capacity, they are no longer at the mercy of every emotional current around them. Because the real shift is not in what they feel, it's in what they do with what they feel. And when you can hold your own emotional world without needing to discharge it onto others, you step into a level of self-mastery that cannot be easily shaken. Because true strength is not the absence of emotion, it is the ability to transform it without losing yourself in the process. As this internal stability begins to take hold, another layer of transformation quietly unfolds, one that is perhaps more confronting than anything that came before. Because for most empaths, much of their identity, has been organized around being needed, being appreciated, being seen as good, kind, indispensable. And beneath that identity, often unexamined, is a deep relationship with external validation. Not in a superficial sense, but in a deeply human one. To be valued, to be understood, to be recognized, these are not trivial needs. They are rooted in our earliest experiences of attachment. For the empath, especially, approval often became a kind of emotional currency. It signaled safety. It reassured them that their efforts to maintain connection were working. And so, without realizing it, they began to orient themselves around it. They learned to read the room not just to understand, but to adjust. They learned to give not just from care, but from a subtle hope of being affirmed. They learned to prioritize harmony, even when it meant silencing parts of themselves. But as they moved through this process, through the collapse of Naïve empathy, through the development of discernment, through the power of silence, and the practice of emotional alchemy, something becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. They begin to feel the cost of being liked at the expense of being real. And this is where a profound internal conflict emerges. Because the empath now sees what they didn't see before. They recognize the moments where they would have once agreed just to avoid tension. The times they would have softened their truth to remain acceptable. The ways they shaped themselves to fit into expectations that were never consciously chosen. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. So the question changes. It's no longer, will this make them accept me? It becomes, is this honest? And those two questions do not always lead to the same answer. This is where the detachment from external validation begins. Not as a rejection of connection, but as a redefinition of it. The empath starts to understand that being understood is not something they can control. That approval is not a reliable measure of truth. That people will interpret them through their own lenses, their own wounds, their own limitations, and that no amount of explanation can fully manage that. This realization can feel isolating at first, because when you stop organizing yourself around others' perceptions, you inevitably disrupt the roles you once played. People who were comfortable with the version of you that was accommodating, agreeable, endlessly available, they may struggle with this shift. They may question it, resist it, even misinterpret it as coldness or distance. But what is actually happening is something far more grounded. You are no longer negotiating your identity. You are no longer asking, who do I need to be accepted here? You are asking, can I remain myself in this space? And if the answer is no, you begin to step back, not with resentment, but with clarity. This is what sovereignty looks like in practice. It's not loud. It doesn't need to prove itself. It simply refuses to fragment in order to belong. The empath begins to choose authenticity over approval, even when that choice comes with discomfort. Even when it means being misunderstood. Even when it means standing alone in moments where they would have once reached outward for reassurance. And over time, something stabilizes within that choice. They begin to feel a different kind of grounding, not the fragile stability that comes from being validated, but the deeper, more enduring stability that comes from self-alignment. They trust themselves more. They rely less on external feedback to determine their worth. And as a result, their presence becomes more consistent, less reactive, less dependent. This doesn't mean they no longer care what others think. It means that what others think no longer defines them. And that distinction is everything. Because when you are no longer driven by the need to be liked, your relationships begin to change. They become more honest, more selective, more real. You stop performing connection and start experiencing it. You stop overextending to maintain bonds that require your self-betrayal. You begin to meet others as you are, not as who you think you need to be. And that is where true connection becomes possible. So when we speak of the empath becoming dangerous, at this stage, what we are really pointing to is this quiet, unwavering shift. They can no longer be shaped by the need for approval. They cannot be pulled back into patterns that depend on their self-doubt. They are anchored in something deeper than perception. And once that anchor is in place, there is a freedom that emerges, one that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't wait for validation. Because the moment you stop seeking confirmation of your worth from the outside is the moment you begin to live from it within. And what begins to emerge at the far end of this process is something that doesn't announce itself loudly, doesn't seek recognition, and doesn't need to be validated to exist. It is a quiet authority, one that is not constructed through performance, but revealed through integration. Because by this stage, the empath is no longer divided within themselves. Earlier, there were competing forces. The need to connect versus the need to protect. The desire to be authentic versus the fear of being rejected. The instinct to care versus the exhaustion of overgiving. These internal tensions created a kind of fragmentation, where different parts of the self would take turns leading, often depending on the situation. But now, something has come together. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to create coherence. The empath has begun to integrate what they feel, what they see, and how they respond. Their boundaries are no longer reactions to past wounds. They are expressions of present clarity. Their empathy is no longer an unconscious reflex. It is a conscious offering. Their silence is no longer a defense. It is a choice. And in that integration, there is stability. They are no longer easily pulled into roles that don't align with who they are. They are no longer compelled to fix, to rescue, to explain, to convince, not because they don't care, but because they understand the limits of what care can and cannot do. This is where their presence begins to carry a different kind of weight. It's not forceful. It doesn't dominate. But it is unmistakable. When they enter a space, they are fully there. Not scattered across other people's emotions, not preoccupied with managing perceptions, not negotiating their identity. Just present. And presence, when it is grounded in self-awareness, has a way of revealing things. People may feel seen around them, sometimes more clearly than they are comfortable with. Not because the empath is analyzing or judging, but because they are no longer distorting reality to maintain comfort. They are reflecting what is, simply by not participating in what is false. This is what makes their silence dangerous, because it is not empty, it is precise. It does not rush to fill gaps or smooth over tension. It allows things to surface. It creates space where truth can become visible, even if that truth is inconvenient. And for those who are used to avoiding that kind of clarity, it can feel confronting. But again, this is not about power over others. It is about alignment within the self. The empath no longer needs to control outcomes. They no longer need to ensure that everyone feels comfortable, or that every interaction resolves neatly. They understand that discomfort is often part of truth, and that growth does not always feel harmonious in the moment. So they stop interfering. They stop over-functioning in relationships that require mutual responsibility. They stop absorbing what others are unwilling to face. They stop translating reality into something more palatable. And instead, they hold their position with calm, with steadiness, with a kind of grounded certainty that does not need to be defended. This is quiet authority. It doesn't argue. It doesn't chase. It doesn't persuade. It simply stands. And that standing, rooted in self-trust, shaped by awareness, refined through experience, becomes the empath's most powerful expression, because it invites a different kind of interaction. One that is based not on roles or expectations, but on presence and truth. Some people will meet them there, others won't. And for the first time, the empath is at peace with that. Because they are no longer trying to create connection at any cost. They are allowing connection to arise where there is alignment. And where there isn't, they step back, not with resentment, but with understanding. This is what it means to become unshakable. Not rigid, not closed, but deeply rooted, able to remain open without losing center, able to engage without dissolving, able to walk away without collapsing, And in a world where so much interaction is driven by unconscious patterns, by unmet needs, by unexamined fears, this kind of presence stands out. Not because it demands attention, but because it doesn't need it. So when we say the empath becomes dangerous in silence, what we are really pointing to is this final shift. They have come home to themselves. And once you are no longer willing to leave yourself to maintain connection, everything changes. Because the greatest power you will ever hold is not in how deeply you understand others, but in how firmly you are rooted in who you are when you do.